Hello, I'm Michael Holmes, and today I'm talking to Paul Thomas Chamberlain. Paul, you are Associate Professor of History at Columbia University. You are the author of The Cold War Killing Fields. This is a great book about the Cold War, and we already agreed that we're going to talk about this book at another time, because today we want to talk about your new book called Scorched Earth. Your writing has also appeared in the New York Times and the Washington Post. So, Scorched Earth is a book about the Second World War. I think it is an important book on the topic because it sheds a new light in a masterful way. It is not that easy to point a finger on what exactly is the perspective you're shining on it. The
Mhm.
easiest way to say it is that you're trying to show that this was a war between brutal and racist imperial nations on all sides. Now, that may seem provocative because most people think this was like a good versus evil struggle between the liberal democracies against the fascist tyrannies. And this more conventional view is, of course, not entirely wrong.
Mhm.
I think we all agree that we should be happy and celebrate that the Allied forces won this contest because the Axis powers were definitely the greater evil. Um, but there are many buts to this. There's far more nuance to this, and this, I think, is what the book is really about. You do actually show that the Allies and the Axis forces were far more similar in their motivations and in the way they conducted the wars and the genocides and the crimes um, than most people, are aware of or want to
Mhm.
be aware of also. So
Yeah.
first, can you give us like a rough idea about what are you trying to do with this book?
Yeah. So um, the general idea of what I'm trying to do with the book is to situate the history of the Second World War in a longer story about the rise and fall of world empires. Um, I think that too much of the existing literature and too much of the conventional interpretation of World War II is, as you described it, it's portrayed as this clash between nations of the liberal capitalist world against fascist nations. And in that respect, it does have a large degree of moral clarity. Um,
Mhm.
as I write in the book, I don't think anyone serious or any serious scholar really laments the fact that the Axis powers lost. And absolutely, it was a better outcome of the war to have the Allies emerge victorious. But I think that that dimension and that sort of moral clarity and that sense that the correct side emerged victorious has had the effect of kind of stifling a lot of the interesting historical debates around World War II. Um, this is something that I encounter a lot in my teaching. Right. So when I teach classes on foreign relations and foreign policy history, I talk a lot about World War II. And what I usually like to do with my students is I assign them competing interpretations, right? So I'll have them read 4 or 5 articles, say, on the outbreak of the First World War, right? And they'll have one article that blames the Germans. They'll have one article that blames the British. They'll have one article that, looks at the larger structure of the international system. They'll have one article that argues that the fact that the United States wasn't more deeply involved in the international system in the run up to 1914 is an important factor in shaping the way that the First World War played out. And I find that generates much better discussion, and my teaching is more interesting when the students have competing interpretations and there's conflict within the readings, right? The readings
Mhm.
disagree with one another. So in teaching these classes, I always talk about World War II because World War II is such an important part of this larger story. But I have a very hard time finding readings that have this same amount of disagreement and conflict, this sort of interpretive conflict. And so I wanted to do that for World War One, or for rather for World War II. I wanted to kind of push back against a conventional narrative that is very straightforward, very simple, very sort of good versus evil, and bring a little bit more nuance, as you said, into the story. And the way that I do that, as I said before, is by approaching this not as a clash of nation states, but rather as a clash of empires. Because
Mhm.
all of the major belligerents in World War II were imperial powers. In some form or another. The easy ones are, of course, the British Empire, which is the largest empire in the world, the French Empire, which is probably the second largest, but of course, Germany is an aspiring empire. It is looking to Eastern Europe as the territory that it's going to use to build its new empire. The Italians are also very much committed to this project of building a new Roman Empire. And of course, Japan is also trying to enter this imperial game. So I think that's a very important starting point for rethinking the history of the Second World War. It's not an argument that is necessarily designed to unsettle that kind of moral clarity regarding this idea that that Allied victory was ultimately a good thing, uh, as opposed to Axis victory. But I think it does open the door to a lot of new and interesting questions that we can ask about World War II, and it allows us to think about the war in new ways.
Yeah, let's start about the roots of the Second World War because you start by outlining what was actually the global situation at the time in the 1920s and 30s between the world wars, um, which really matters to the rise of Hitler and to the rise of the expansionist, militarist right in Japan, and of course Mussolini in Italy, because you try to show that, or just to remind the reader that at the time, the British Empire, as you said, was by far the most powerful empire on the planet, in fact, in all of history at that point in time. The second largest empire was the French Empire, and the third largest was the US Empire, actually, which was already being a little bit of a different beast, but it was also an imperial empire, for example, in the Philippines. And this matters for the root causes of the conflict in two different ways that seem almost a bit paradoxical, because on the one hand, you try to show that you do show convincingly that the British and the French and the Americans served as role models
Mhm.
for the Nazis and Japanese imperialists. They looked up to them in many, many ways and wanted to do the same thing. So that was one way. And the other way was that those empires were seen as an existential threat. There's a lot of truth in that to Germany, Italy, and Japan, and many other
Mhm.
nations, because they have already conquered pretty much all of the globe, dominated all of the globe. And so there was not much space left for any upcoming nation, which meant
Mhm.
a lot of existential fear for your security and also economically. And after the First World War and the Order of Versailles, especially Germany, Italy, and Japan all fear that they're gonna be just become colonies
Right.
of the existing global powers. So they feel under a severe threat, both when it comes to security of the nation and also when it comes to economics, when it comes to being poor or being part of the rich great powers. So in two ways, you try to show that the Western powers paradoxically are part of the problem when it comes to the origins of Second World War. One,
Hmm.
by serving as a role model, they're imitating what you're doing. And second of all, by really scaring the hell out of people in many countries and then making them try a desperate attempt to break out of this stranglehold. So can you address both these issues?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a very good characterization of my argument. So I think that, returning to this to the matter of thinking about World War II in this imperial framework, um, World War II is, in my mind, very much this 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 turning point in the centuries long story about imperialism in world history. And it's for that reason that when I think about World War II and when I start the book, I'm very careful to argue that the world of the early 20th century is very much a world of empires. Empires are the most important players on the international stage. The majority of the world community lives inside an empire. Either you are an imperial citizen or you are a subject, a colonial subject of an empire. Empire is just the most common form of large-scale political organization as we head into the 20th century. And for the first half of the 20th century, that remains the case. It's only with the end of World War II that we see the world start to change and we see the appearance of a new international order that is made up primarily of nation states as opposed to empires. And I think that, just establishing that baseline is really important. But beyond that, the project of empire is very much at the center of how people understood international relations in the lead up to World War II, right? They're thinking about, as I said, they're thinking about the world being separated into various competing empires. And particularly for an aspiring power such as Germany or Italy or Japan, empire seems like the only way to really get a spot at the table, so to speak, in terms of figuring out dynamics of international power. If you want your nation to be a powerful nation on the world stage, it seems like you have to have an empire circa 1930, right? Somebody like Mussolini or Hitler, or the string of leaders that are going to be in charge in Tokyo. They're looking at the United States. The United States is a powerful country. It has a very large continent that is mostly under its control. So it has extensive access to natural resources. It has overseas colonies. Britain is, in some ways a special case in that it's a fairly small nation, but it has gone out into the world and conquered this vast empire. The Soviet Union is also, it very much appears as an imperial power, albeit a different kind of imperial power. It's a sort of revolutionary Bolshevik empire. But it also has access to vast continental territories, and it is also expanding, particularly along its western border into Eastern Europe as we get into the 1920s and 1930s. And that expansion will continue right up to the start of World War II in Europe. So the lesson to a lot of these aspiring world leaders in places like Rome or Tokyo or Berlin is that if you want to be an important player on the world stage, you have to have an empire. And it looks like they're running out of time to build this imperial territory. Most of the world has already been conquered by one of the established empires. And even more concerning than that, there is this sense that is very palpable in the interwar years, in the 1920s and 1930s, that the rising power of the United States in the West and or the Soviet Union in the East represents a new threat to these world powers around the globe, right?
Mhm.
That if the United States is entirely successful in its meteoric rise from, just a small, fairly poor set of colonies in the 18th century to this economic, industrial, capitalist juggernaut in the first half of the 20th century, that there is a very real sense that the United States might come to completely dominate the world economy. And if that happens, then the various nations of Europe and East Asia will essentially be at the mercy of American leaders. Conversely, if you look at the Soviet Union, if you're a German or Japanese or Italian leader, looking at the Soviet Union in the 1920s or 1930s, there is this fear of a left-wing Bolshevik revolution that is being directed and sustained with the support of Moscow, right? This is the sort of Bolshevik menace that is very much a dark fantasy in the minds of many world leaders.
Mhm.
So there is a very clear sense in many of the Axis or in many of the countries that will join the Axis that they have a short window of time to build themselves up and to seize these colonial or imperial territories in order to build themselves up into powerful countries that can resist the capitalist onslaught from the United States in the West or the Bolshevik onslaught from the Soviet Union in the East. And the only way that they're going to be able to do this is to seize their own colonial territories and
Mhm.
begin to suck up all the resources and all the power that empire will provide them in order to stand up and challenge either the United States and or the Soviet Union. So they're very much operating in this imperial framework when they're devising what we would today call grand strategy. So I think that's a very important component. Another important component of this argument is this notion that there's also a transformation of imperialism taking place in the middle of the 20th century. You have kind of an older imperial model that is kind of the epitome of which is probably the British Empire, where you have, a fairly small country that is able to, in various ways go out into the world, build an empire, and exert power and influence in that way. And this is very much what the Germans are trying to do, what the Italians are trying to do, what the Japanese are trying to do. Uh, on the other hand, you have this kind of new imperialism that is typified on the one hand by the United States and on the other hand by the Soviet Union, and that you have these continent spanning superstates that are also imperial powers. So they combine not only the potential for sort of massive ideologically driven force projection that we see later on in the Cold War, but also, they have so they can move beyond their territory and exert influence, but they also have
Mhm.
massive territory. So they're both
Mhm.
continental powers and they have the potential to be global powers. And I think World War II, one of the interesting dimensions of the war is the way that the older sort of 19th century style imperialism begins to fall apart. And
Mhm.
this new, what you might think of as superpower imperialism is
Mhm.
on the rise. And so World War II is, on the one hand, it's a clash between the Allies and the Axis, but it's also a contest between these older imperial powers like the British and the French and these rising imperial kind of superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States. So it's really a multivalent competition that's taking place.
Yeah, and I think we should come back to that later, but let's first stick a little bit to the origins of World War II. I mean, you first of all, I think we should also talk a little bit about the Versailles Treaty and the Versailles Order, because this idea of the German public and not just the Nazis and the Japanese public and not just the militaristic imperialists, and the same in Italy, those fears were not completely unfounded. They were not just paranoid. Of course, their fears about the Jewish world conspiracy were completely paranoid and completely
Mhm.
unfounded. We should say that. But
Yeah.
the idea that Germany is under threat and that Japan is under threat was not. That was a reality. And the other thing to come back to that is I was really fascinated by the quotes you have from Hitler and other Nazi leaders and also Japanese leaders, where they talk
Mhm.
about their admiration of the British Empire, of
Right.
the American Empire, and compare themselves to that. Said we just want the same, basically.
Right. Yeah. Um, so there's a lot there. To take up the last point, one of the things that really jumped out at me when I was doing the research for this book was the way that Japanese leaders were self-consciously invoking the Monroe Doctrine, right?
Hmm.
Which the Monroe Doctrine is this statement made by the United States in 1823 that essentially tells the other European empires to keep their hands off of Latin America. That it's a very early declaration of the United States' intention to mark out a sphere of influence that includes pretty much the entirety of the Western Hemisphere. Right. So
Hmm.
North and South America is kind of it's a hands-off policy in terms of the European empires. It's declared very early. The United States doesn't have the capacity to enforce it until much later in the 19th century or even into the 20th century. But it is a statement where the United States is essentially saying, America or the United States is going to be the preeminent power in the Western Hemisphere. This is our sphere of influence. Japan looks at this, or rather, Japanese leaders look at this, and they want to do the same thing in East Asia. And so what they're kind of fumbling toward over the course of the 1930s is a Japanese Monroe Doctrine, and they specifically call it this. There are,
Right,
you go back and find publications where, this is Japan's Monroe Doctrine.
right.
Germany does similar things as well, and indeed, there's early diplomacy in the opening stages of World War II in Europe, where the Americans are actually going to go. This is before the United States enters the war. American diplomats are going to reach out to German diplomats and kind of encourage them to be to restrain their war making capacity, and Germany will reply that it respects the Monroe Doctrine in the Western Hemisphere, and the United States ought to grant the same sort of privileges to Germany in Europe.
Mhm.
So so it goes back to what you said earlier that it is very much a case where Axis leaders are looking at the United States and Britain as models for what they're trying to do on the world stage. Regarding the Versailles Order, and this is a point that the historian of the Soviet Union, Stephen Kotkin, makes, and I think a very important point. The Versailles Order that emerges out of World War I is a fundamentally unstable order. And it is fundamentally unstable because it looks to Britain and France to serve as the arbiters of world power, or at least power in Europe. And the fact is, and again, this ties back to my earlier point about the old imperialism versus the new imperialism. By the time that you get to the 1920s and 1930s, Britain and France are no longer the most powerful players on the world stage, yet they are tasked with upholding the international order. The most powerful players on the world stage are the United States and the Soviet Union, but neither, for different reasons, neither one of them is involved or neither one of them is committed to defending the Versailles Order. So it's inherently unstable as we get into the 1930s. And that ultimately is going to provide an opening for these Axis powers to insert themselves and mount their challenge.
Mhm. Um, I wonder
And
if
there
we
was a
if
third
we
part to your question too. I'm slipping my it's
can you
slip.
can you say a little bit more because I think it's quite shocking what Hitler says about the British Empire and the American genocide against Native Americans and so on, and how that applies then later to Operation Barbarossa and so on.
Yeah, so Hitler in particular is looking at the British experience in India. And he sees this as a model for what Germany might be able to do in Eastern Europe. And specifically, what he's talking about is he's talking about the ability of a relatively small number of British imperial officials
Hmm.
to oversee a massive population in South Asia. And he hopes that a comparable number of German officials will be able to administer a German empire in Eastern Europe over the Slavic peoples that live there. Um, it- then, when he turns his gaze west across the Atlantic Ocean, he's looking at the United States, and he looks at the long and horrific history of really the sort of ethnic cleansing of North America that took place in America's colonial history and in the first 100 or so years of the existence of the United States, and he sees this as another potential model for empire building. And again, this is this notion of expanding across the continent, clearing out new territory, and opening it up for colonial settlement and expansion that will be used to create the power base for a new German empire, in the same sense that the expansion across North America created the base for the United States to emerge as a great world empire by the end of the 19th century.
So what you show then is basically that Second World War starts with an attempt of Japan and Germany and Italy to break out of this stranglehold, that they feel threatened. The nation is threatened by the global powers that have divided pretty much all of the globe
Hmm.
up between them, the Western powers, Britain, France, and the US, and to some degree Holland and Belgium and so on. And they do that by emulating them, by trying to create their own colonial imperialist system that brings them the resources and the military strengths and the land that will enable them to win a global battle for hegemony. First, to win to become like regional hegemons in their own region, like in the
Hmm.
case of Germany and Europe, in the case of Japan and Asia, throw out the colonialists, the imperialists, and become themselves imperialists in that region. And then, if necessary, also like turn to the last like Manichaean, dramatic global battle for global hegemony.
Hmm.
So that I think you show very well in the book. The other thing is also that Now we also have to talk about why actually the Western powers get into the war, because we just assume, of course, they get into the war because there are these very evil powers, and of course we have to defeat them because we want to defeat evil, right? Because we're the good guys. But you
Right.
show that the reason why they get into the war and the way they fight it, both in their strategy and so on, is actually quite self-interested, and it's all about preserving their empires. So why do
Yeah.
the US and Britain and France, how do they get involved and how do they react?
Yeah, so and this is, as you said, this is one of the ways that that the conventional narrative of the World War II has, or the conventional narrative of the war has kind of pushed back and warped our understanding. There is this general sense that, part of this is the act of framing World War II as this clash between democracy and fascism, which ignores the Soviet Union, ignores China, which were key players in the war. But it's this idea that the ultimately what the Allies and the Axis were fighting about was fascism. But the fact is that Germany had been fascist for quite some time.
Mhm.
Prior to the outbreak of World War II, Italy had been fascist for much longer. There is an ongoing scholarly debate among historians about whether or not we should even classify Japan as a fascist, or rather Imperial Japan as a fascist power, which we can talk about more about. We can talk more about if you want later. But the reality is that the various states that will come to constitute the Allied powers are not attacking, or they're not going to war with any of the Axis powers because of their political ideology. They go to war with with the Axis powers because the Axis powers are launching wars of imperial expansion. Right. So Germany, or rather Britain and France declare war on Germany, not because Germany is a Nazi state, but rather because Germany invades Poland. Right. This is this sort of threat to the existing structure of the international order is what triggers the outbreak of the war in Europe. Similarly, the essence of the war in Asia is not based on any sort of opposition to Japanese political ideology as it exists inside Japan itself. It's
Mhm.
an opposition to to the threat that Japan represents to the regional order in Asia. The fact that Japan has invaded parts of China, that Japan is branching out and begins attacking these Pacific colonial possessions of the Western empires. Burma, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, the Philippines. This is what triggers the outbreak of the war between the Western powers and Japan in Asia, right? So once again, this sort of ideological focus on the war obscures this underlying dimension that while ideology may have played a role in driving those attacks, it was those attacks themselves rather than any sort of ideological animosity that sparked the outbreak of the war. And ultimately, what the Allies are trying to do is to, at least early on in the war, is to defend the existing international order, which, as I said earlier, is an imperial order
Mhm.
against the threats that the Axis powers represent. Um, the United States, I think, deserves special mention in this,
Mhm.
because the United States, particularly in American history, we are taught that the United States is kind of this unwitting player in the lead up to the war. This notion that
Mhm.
the Americans don't want to go to war, they don't want to be involved. They are horrified at what they're witnessing first in China and the Far East, but then soon enough by the outbreak of the war in Europe and the collapse of France. And all that is true, but it ignores this kind of quiet conversation that is happening inside the halls of power in Washington, D.C., where the United States very, very early on is coming around to this conclusion that one way or another, the United States is going to enter the war, and it needs to enter the war in a way where it will be in a position at the end of the war to dictate the terms of the peace and to
Hmm.
create what is fundamentally a new international order in the minds of American leaders. All right, so let me unpack that a little bit.
Hmm.
The key factor in triggering a lot of this is the collapse of France in the late spring and early summer of 1940. And this is a moment when American leaders recognize that the international order that has existed since the end of World War II is falling apart. Right? As I said earlier, Britain and France are tasked with defending the Versailles order that emerges from World War I, and France has just collapsed. Britain has been badly beaten by the German offensive, and the British have, the British army has narrowly escaped across the English Channel, and Britain is no longer a serious threat to Germany, or at least does not appear to be in the summer of 1940. And it's in this moment that American leaders sit down and they start to figure out how they're going to respond, right? Because they're shocked and appalled by what's happened. But once it becomes clear that Britain is likely to survive this initial onslaught by the German military, the Americans start kind of transforming their understanding of national security and their grand strategy in such a way as to prepare the United States to enter the war in Europe. They are very much aware that one way or another, they're probably going to be pulled into the war in the Pacific. But they decide pretty early on, and this is specifically in November of 1940, they decide that they will enter the war and that they will fight the war in Europe first. Right? This is still more than a year out from Pearl Harbor, but there's a critical document. It's become known among scholars as the Plan Dog memo. And it's essentially Plan D or Dog. And it becomes the guiding strategy that the United States will follow during the Second World War. And it is a strategy that argues that the United States must fight and defeat Germany first, right, which is a cornerstone of the U.S. Strategy to win the war. And it specifically outlines a plan to use the infrastructure of the British Empire as a launch pad for the United States to attack the Axis powers. Right.
Right.
And so this is very early on. This is in 1940. Even before this, in September of 1940, the United States comes out with the destroyers for bases deal with the British Empire. And this is essentially a plan where the United States will give old decommissioned destroyers, ships, mainly used for, or a lot of which is used for anti-submarine warfare. They're going to give these ships to the British in exchange for 99-year leases on British colonial bases in the Western Hemisphere. Right. And so here, this is a case of the United States directly kind of moving into colonial military positions that are occupied by the British Empire in exchange for the United States giving Britain weapons. And this is long before Pearl Harbor, right? Pearl Harbor is in December of 1941. We're talking September 1940. So very early on, the United States has decided that it will enter the war. And again, the Americans are getting into the war not because they dislike fascism. They're getting into the war because they recognize that the rise of the Axis powers threatens to destabilize the international order, or rather, it already has destabilized and essentially destroyed the international order, and that the United States needs to become involved in this war in order to build a new order. And I would emphasize, this is a deliberate plan on the part of American leaders.
So basically, the US and Britain together, used the American imperial system built up long before the war, and then the British Empire, the largest in world history up to that point, to have a global strategy to defeat the Axis powers. They do
Mhm.
that to defend those empires, and of course, they're their own nation states too. And what also really matters here and also shows how brutally self-interested they are is also what they don't do instead, because they do not just invade early on Europe to directly defeat the Nazi threat. They are basically fighting the Italians in North Africa and so on. They are avoiding this big confrontation, and the reason is because they realize they can force the Soviets and
Mhm.
also the Chinese in the East, but let's first focus on the more important issue. They can force the Soviet Union under Stalin to do most of the fighting. And you show this is a very deliberate, cynical, self-interested strategy. Even so understandable because like nobody wants their own, young men to kill and die. You would rather do someone else do it.
Mhm.
Yeah, can you talk about this? I think that's a great
Yeah.
one of the big strengths of the book that you show that more than any other book I've read on Second World War, that you have the proof that it's a deliberate strategy to let the Soviet Union do most of the fighting and killing and dying, and we are doing like this. We're doing like this peripheral, like we're defending our global empire, but we stay away from the real serious fighting.
Yeah. Yeah. So what I argue in the book is that when we think about what the Allies are doing in the war to defeat the Axis powers, it's really there are really two different types of conflicts happening, right? On the one hand, you have these essentially continental slaughterhouses where you have large land empires in the form of Germany and the Soviet Union clashing in these massive land battles, right, generating millions of casualties. Over 20 million Soviet citizens are going to be killed in the course of the war. And the other really large scale fighting that's happening during World War II is taking place inside China, where again you have millions of casualties being generated by the war between the Chinese military forces and the Japanese army. And that is where the overwhelming majority of the fighting is taking place. Throughout the war, something, 80, 90% of Axis forces are actually engaged fighting either the Chinese or the Soviets. Right. So the focus of violence during World War II is really taking place on the Eurasian continent, right? It's taking place along the Eastern Front in Europe and inside continental China. Now, what the British and the Americans are doing during the war is it looks much more, they're fighting much more of a sort of maritime colonial war, right? They're using their incredibly powerful navies to establish control over lines of communication or shipping lines that connect both North America to the United Kingdom, but also shipping lines that really circle the globe across the Pacific Ocean. And they're really reliant on their naval forces. And when they do engage in land fighting, a lot of it is based around amphibious invasions, which are another product of this sort of 19th century colonialism, where the British and the Americans learned to build powerful, coherent marine infantry that they kind of use as colonial infantry that they send into to colonies. They can land on a beach and they can mount a military invasion using their navies. And this type of warfare has a lot of advantages for the British and the Americans. Specifically, the Anglo-American allies are able to choose when and where they fight. They are not in the same position as, say, the Soviets or the Chinese, where they're reacting to Axis military offensives on the continent, right? And so the Soviets, for a lot of the war, are essentially fighting a defensive war. They've been invaded by the German, by the Wehrmacht, and they are, struggling to survive this Nazi onslaught. Similar process is happening inside China. Meanwhile, the Americans and the British get to choose when and how they fight this war. Now, initially, the British and the Americans simply don't have the capacity to launch a full-scale invasion of Europe. They're considering it in 1942, but that is so far-fetched as to be kind of ridiculous. It would be nothing more than a diversion. It would probably be a huge catastrophe. And so they really kind of back away from this notion of invading Europe in 1942. But there's very serious consideration of launching an invasion and I should say kind of Northwest Europe in 1943. This sort of cross-channel invasion of Europe. But this is derailed by Winston Churchill and British leaders who are, on the one hand, they're very eager to avoid the sort of mass casualties that they experienced in the First World War. There's this sense in Britain that an entire generation of young men was lost on the battlefields of Verdun and the Somme, and that they don't want to repeat that mistake. There's also a sense, however, that what British leaders are trying to do is secure a colonial periphery around the Axis powers and secure access to their colonial possessions, particularly in the Middle East. This sort of fraught nature of Egypt and the kind of protectorate status of Egypt. The British are looking at their colonies in Asia. They're looking at their colony in India, and they are aware that if they win this war, or if they survive this war, only to lose all of their imperial territories, that they will no longer be a great power. And so they rather expertly kind of maneuver the United States into a position where the Americans and the British are going to focus their warfighting capacity on securing access to these colonial territories before they really consider moving against France and Germany in the heart of Europe. So a lot of the earliest military campaigns that the Americans and the British are going to fight are in places like the Mediterranean, right? So they're going to land in North Africa before they land in Normandy. Um, so I don't think it starts off as entirely cynical. I think it starts off as pragmatic, but as time goes by, there is a growing realization that the Americans and the British are in this very enviable position where the Soviet Union, who they don't particularly like, American and British leaders are deeply distrustful and suspicious of Stalin and the communist leadership of the Soviet Union.
Right.
The Soviets are bearing the overwhelming majority of the German assault, right? They're bearing the brunt of this. It's Soviet soldiers rather than British or American soldiers that are being slaughtered on the Eastern Front. And as long as the Soviet Union remains in the war, Germany cannot win the war. And it's at this point where things start to become a little bit more cynical. You've got the very famous phrase from Harry Truman, who at the time is just the junior senator from Missouri. But he essentially says, this is upon learning about the outbreak of Operation Barbarossa and the German invasion of the Soviet Union. He essentially says something to the effect of, we should just stay out of it and let them kill each other. I no matter what, I want Germany to lose, but I'm not particularly interested in seeing Stalin and the Soviet Union win either.
Mhm.
So by the time you get into 1943 and definitely by 1944, there is this very clear sense among American and British leaders that the Soviets are carrying most of the burden in fighting against Germany, and that this is a somewhat desirable situation, so much so that they begin coming up with contingency plans to send primarily American, but there may be some British forces as well involved, paratroopers into Berlin in the event of a German collapse. So, by the time that you get into early 1944, a lot of the fears that American and British leaders are expressing are not that the Axis powers are going to win the war, but rather that the Soviets are going to win too quickly, and they will win the war before the Americans and the British can land in Western Europe, and that will create a situation where the Soviet Union will just completely dominate the continent and be able to dictate terms of the peace.
Mhm.
And so, one of the motivations behind what becomes the invasion of Normandy is this realization on the part of American and British leaders that they have to get large numbers of military forces inside Europe before the Germans collapse, because otherwise, the post-war situation will be completely controlled by the Soviet Union.
Yeah, well, you also show very convincingly in the book that around the end of 1942, it's like the turning point. In 1942, the Axis powers are of the height of their challenge.
Mhm.
And it's for a moment, that must have been one of the worst times in human history. Like anybody like concerned about the human race would have been like very excited and fearful.
Mhm.
Um, but then it becomes quite clear at the end of 1942 that the Allies are going to win this. Um, and then especially 1943. So in
Yeah.
1943, every month goes by, and you show that with statistics like about military capacities and industrial capacities, and it just becomes very clear that the Allied powers, and especially the United States and the Soviet Union, in different ways, are going to win the war. And
Yeah.
that's the point when it's clear that the strategies of the US and of Britain become quite cynical and self-interested. And of course, everybody else is self-interested too. So is the Soviet Union. I don't mean to pick on them just because that's what most people would question. Um, and this cynicism shows in three ways at this point. One is they deliberately have this tactic to let the Soviet Union do most of the fighting, and that's exactly what happens. And that would like
Mhm.
weaken the Soviet Union, and they're doing something similar in China that would weaken China. And in the end, it would make clear that when the war is over and they already know they are winning, the United States will be the only superpower, the Soviet Union will be weak, Nazi Germany will be defeated, Japan will be defeated, and the United States will come out of top on top. And that's exactly what's going to happen. And
Sure.
very few of their own soldiers are going to die. I mean, we should pay tribute to all the American and British soldiers who died, but they were like just a fraction of the Soviet soldiers and the Chinese soldiers of both the nationalists and the communists in China. And so that's one way the cynicism shows, the self-interested imperialist thinking. And the the other way this shows is that the one way that they can try to contribute to the defeat directly and directly challenge Germany and Japan
Hmm.
is by very cruel air campaigns, firebombing, and then also Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And you show in the book many crimes by the Allied forces, also by the Soviet Union, of course. We should not forget, maybe we should come to that also.
Hmm.
But the Western powers, the main way they fight Nazi Germany, the main way they fight Japan for a long time is
Yeah.
by deliberately targeting civilians by the hundreds of thousands. Very cynical mass murder.
Yeah. Yeah. A couple things I would say about those points. I think it's important to think about the casualty figures among the Allies, you know, which you raised. Um, there are still hundreds of thousands of American and British troops that die in the war, right?
Right,
So this is still an incredibly bloody war for the British and the Americans.
right.
And in nearly any other war, if it's somewhere in the area of 400,000 Americans and a very similar number of British citizens die in the war, this would be a massive war. If
Hmm.
the United States, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of casualties. The American wars in Iraq and Afghanistan in the 21st century, for the Americans, were much, much smaller. I mean,
Right.
it's
Yes.
thousands as opposed to hundreds of thousands. And it's only in World War II when you look at the casualty figures that were suffered by the Soviets and the Chinese that the American and British death tolls seem small, right? Because you're talking about tens
Of
of
course.
millions of Chinese and Soviets
Yeah.
that are killed. But that is a really important dynamic for understanding how the war was fought on the one hand, understanding the different strategies that the various belligerents were following, but also understanding the post-war zeitgeist that emerges right after
Hmm.
1945, because there is this sense among particularly the Soviets, but also I think among much of the Chinese population, that they had paid massive, massive sacrifices, and sacrifices that just completely outweigh, millions of debt, tens of millions versus hundreds of thousands. Um, and that then, particularly in the case of the Soviets, that they were deprived the sort of respect that they had earned, and they were not given the influence they deserved in shaping the post 1945 world order, uh, after having made such massive sacrifices.
Hmm.
Um, and so I think that's a really important dynamic to understand, and I think that's an important part that's an important force shaping the Cold War as it emerges circa 1945, 1946, is this sense that the sacrifice paid by the different belligerents was dramatically uneven. A second point I would make is that there are a lot of leaders in the United States that do want to enter the war in Europe sooner than um, the spring of 1944. In particular, George Marshall, the sort of the top military leader in the United States, and the sort of the mastermind that organizes American military forces to fight effectively in the Second World War, is pushing very hard for an earlier invasion of Europe, probably to take place in 1943. But he's not able to get his way. It's really the British that are pushing back against this. So, again, I don't believe it's entirely cynical. I don't think it starts off as a cynical policy. I think
Hmm.
it is
Yeah.
it's somewhat more complicated than that. But they definitely are aware of this notion that the Soviets and the Chinese are bearing most of the burden. Um, One of the ways that they claim that American and British leaders claim to be contributing substantially to the defeat of the Germans or to the defeat of Nazi Germany is through aerial bombing, as you said. And this takes the form of largely indiscriminate. It's not initially designed to be indiscriminate, but in practice,
Mhm.
it is indiscriminate. And once they start doing it, they know it's indiscriminate. So it's kind of hard to say that it was an accident. But just area bombing of population centers, which there's a way that we talk about it in euphemisms in post 45 world. We talk about collateral damage, we talk about we talk statistics and figures, but the reality of a lot of this sort of strategic bombing that the Americans and the British were using during World War II is it basically just means you're dropping bombs on civilians and you're killing, just thousands upon thousands of civilians. And this is, I think this is important because it helps us understand what the principal American and British contributions to the war in Europe were prior to the spring of 1944, were basically killing civilians. And I think that is important for all sorts of reasons. But one of the dimensions that I find really interesting is the way that discussions of aerial bombing actually trace back to colonial violence, right? And the interwar period, because this is the first, it's really in the 1920s and 1930s in the colonial world where you first see militaries developing the capacity to launch bombing campaigns against towns and cities in the colonial world. And
Right.
this is a type of violence that is seen, it's kind of coded as savage warfare, which is, again, just a euphemism for colonial warfare or warfare against non-Western peoples. It's abhorrent to think that you would bomb a European city, but if you bomb a city in Ethiopia, when the Italians bomb, Ethiopian cities and towns, there's not the same sort of outcry that you see.
Of course.
Or when the French, use artillery or use aircraft to bomb, Damascus, it's not the same sort of outcry. So there's this sort of brutality that you only really see in the colonial world in the interwar period, as brutality being deployed by the imperial powers against colonial subjects, that then quickly breaks down and is brought into metropolitan Europe with the outbreak of World War II. And that's kind of another way that World War II ends up kind of blurring these lines that are supposed to be established and fixed in 19th and early 20th century Europe, but it all falls apart in the course of this horrific imperial conflict that is the Second World War.
Yeah, I think something your book also shows, it actually contains an explanation, maybe in quotation marks, like sort of explanation to understand um, the cruelty of the
Mhm.
Nazi regime and the Japanese, like why they were even worse than the Allies. Like you show how vicious the Allies could be, but you also show very clearly, it becomes very clear in the book that the Nazi Holocaust is unique in many ways, unique, like the most comprehensive, um, largest genocide in human history, and also the Japanese, their cruelty in many places was quite something. And there is a sort of an explanation in there because You show how, first of all, that they started this challenge to the existing order because they felt they had no choice and they were under an existential threat. And once the war starts and they feel the power of especially the United States, and in the case of Japan, the embargo against Japan is very important because it weakens them. It makes the threat more severe to the nation.
Right.
The greater the threat becomes and the more clear it becomes that their chances are increasingly slim to win this thing, the more desperate they become, the more paranoid they become, and the more cruel they become. So while the Holocaust is also unique in the sense that the Jewish people, and this is important to point out here in this conversation, the Jewish people
Hmm.
were not at war with Nazi Germany at all.
Yeah.
This was just a complete fantasy, a complete madness. And that makes the Holocaust quite unique. But they, the reason why the anti-Semitic paranoia became so extreme that it led to the largest Holocaust genocide in human history was that Germany was losing and they really believed that their fate would be genocide, that they would be the victims of colonial genocide, slavery, oppression for centuries to come, basically, if they lose this.
Hmm.
Um, and there was some truth in that. I think we're getting into very controversial territory here, but I think I've made very clear that there is absolutely no excuse for the crimes of the Nazis or the Japanese or of those of the Allies, of course not. But it's just we do have to think about how did we get into this complete darkness, especially when it comes to the Nazi regime. And I think
Hmm.
one explanation is the brutality and the cynicism of their enemies and the power of their enemies.
Hmm.
How do you feel about that?
The brutality and cynicism of the Western powers, the Western empires.
And the Soviet Union, of course,
So
too. Like we haven't talked about that because the Soviet Union was, of course, a great threat to Germany too.
yeah, I mean,
Um,
I I'm I I am not a historian of Germany. So I'm not I'm not an authority on, what precisely the Germans thought the implications would be of losing the war. But I think rather than, genocide, and, large scale violence, I think what the sentiment in Germany was, and what they feared if they lost the war was that they would essentially be subjugated, uh,
yeah.
beneath this consumer empire that the United States was creating, right? Because the United
Mhm.
States, by the time that we get to the early 20th century, the United States isn't really focused on, large scale, slaughter of populations in the pursuit of colonial goals, right? What the United States is trying to, and the sort of new American empire that is taking shape is very much a capitalist consumer empire, right?
Mhm.
And so I think the Germans are afraid that they will be subjugated and they'll just be consigned to the status of a second tier power in world affairs, which is, in some sense what happens during the Cold War. Um, but I absolutely do think there is something to this idea that what the Axis powers, specifically the German, I mean, the Italians are doing some terrible things too, but not at the same scale.
Mhm.
Certainly not at the same scale as the Germans. Um, I think again, I return to this idea of the 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 interwar period, the first half of the 20th century, um, is this is a world of empires. And what the Germans and the Italians and the Japanese are doing, or what they believe they're doing, is creating new colonial, or they're seizing new colonial territory. And in seizing that territory, they are prosecuting what they see as a series of colonial wars,
Mhm.
right? And here, the distinction between it's kind of it's an enlightenment, or even kind of a 19th century concept of the distinction between civilized war, and I say civilized in scared quotes, and savage war, right?
Mhm.
The so-called savage war. Civilized war takes place between nation states. You have, your soldiers, you put them in uniforms, you give them, whatever firearms or weapons they're going to have. They march out to a battlefield, they fight, there is a battle, the battle is decided, and the war is over.
Mhm.
Uh, it's all very neat, it's very orderly, and it is not designed to generate large numbers of civilian casualties. It's prosecuted in pursuit of very, very immediate, very tangible goals. You're going to, move a border a few miles west or east. You're going to, execute some sort of regime change in a rival capital, something like that, right? You defeat the military and the war is over. That is civilized war, as a lot of the Western powers understand it. In
Mhm.
contrast, savage war or colonial war is something that happens. It's asymmetric. It takes place between an imperial power and usually a non-state society that is either has been or is in the process of being colonized. And the sort of restrictions that are placed on civilized war or so-called civilized war don't apply to so-called colonial war or savage war. In savage war, you're fighting against an entire society. You're fighting an entire population, right? These are the sort of colonial campaigns that really, in retrospect, just look kind of like genocide in
Mhm.
many cases. They include large-scale ethnic cleansing, population resettlement, indiscriminate violence against civilians, collective reprisals. And
Mhm.
this is the sort of war that is fought in the colonial world through the 19th century and into the first half of the 20th century. And this is exactly what the Axis powers think they're doing. And so it should not be a surprise to us that, when the German military goes into the Soviet Union in pursuit of this colonial empire in Eastern Europe, that it looks at these populations that, are coming under its control as, hostile forces in their
Mhm.
entirety, right? Because they're
Right.
fighting savage war. They're fighting a colonial war. The Japanese do the same thing in large parts of China and in parts of the Pacific Islands that they conquer. They're engaged in a colonial war. It's a savage war, and they are not beholden to the laws of warfare as they apply to cases of state versus state. So it really is this mindset of this mentality of fighting a colonial war that I think drives a lot of this violence.
Mhm.
And this is something that you also see in the differences in the war in Europe on the Western Front versus the Eastern Front. Right, the Eastern Front is far more brutal. The treatment of German and Soviet POWs
Right.
Eastern Front is atrocious. Right, there a lot of there are millions of Soviet POWs that are starved to death deliberately in German camps. The Soviets are also
Mm.
executing large numbers of German POWs. The treatment of British and French and American um, uh, and German POWs on the Western Front is much better and much more similar to what we would think of as how you're supposed to treat POWs in the post 45 era. Um, and I think that what and again, part of this is Axis leaders looking at the brutal history of Western imperialism in the 18th and 19th centuries, and the genocide that takes place in various parts of the world, notably in North America, and saying, well, this worked for the United States. This helped give the United States an empire. We're going to do the same thing, except we're going to do it in Eastern Europe. And then so they take that sort of 19th century racism and savage colonial warfare thinking, and they fuse it to a very 20th century total war mindset, which is this notion that, you are going to use the full capacity of the modern industrialized state to
Hmm.
build a, fearsome military and prosecute, violence that would have been unimaginable in past centuries, right? And so what the Axis powers are doing, and particularly Germany, is they're combining that sort of 19th century colonial racist mindset with a 20th century like full scale industrialized total war mindset. And I think that's part of what makes the the Holocaust and the violence that is perpetrated by the Axis powers in World War II so horrific, because they've combined these two things.
Am I correct that both the German leadership and the Japanese leadership, for a long time, the first years of the war, they still have this hope that they can arrange themselves with the other imperial powers and have sort of like an agreement that basically the US has the Monroe Doctrine, Britain has its empire, but Germany also has its empire in Eastern Europe and Russia, and Japan has its empire in East Asia. And they all even get along and maybe even have like sort of like an alliance of the higher races against the lower races, like in a racist order divided among them. Is that not also like a vision in the first years of the war before they give up on that and feel like it's an all-out world war?
Yeah, absolutely. The initially, uh, the German leadership is upset that the British are involved in the war.
Hmm.
As far as a lot of the German leadership is concerned, and particularly Hitler, he thinks that the British, the best interests of the British are actually to probably support the Germans,
Hmm.
because ultimately what Germany is doing, in Hitler's maniacal mind, is, on the one hand, standing up to the Soviet Union and, um, building Western Europe, Central and Western Europe into a political unit that is powerful enough to resist the Soviet Union in the East,
Hmm.
but also the United States. Um, and so, I mean, there's this idea that Hitler has, that the British, sooner or later, are going to recognize that they're going to be able to keep their empire, their global empire, and that they will ultimately be able to cooperate with, Germany. Germany will be the dominant power in Europe.
Hmm.
Uh, it will be, it will be the most powerful state inside, the sort of the European area. But Britain will still be a major player, and will be a major player because it has its navy and because it's maintaining its colonial possessions throughout the wider world. And in this respect, Germany actually kind of wants that to continue, because the Germans, or particularly the Nazis and Hitler, they don't really want an overseas empire. They're not as interested in
Hmm.
overseas empire. They want a continental empire. They want a land empire. They're focused on Eastern Europe, and they don't believe um, that their goals are fundamentally in tension with the goals of the British Empire. The United States is a little bit different in Hitler's mind. The United States is a looming threat in the West. Of course, the feverish anti-Semitism that is, shaping so many of Hitler's ideas, also, leads him to engage in these sort of conspiracy theories about, sort of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories about who's in control in the United States.
Hmm.
Um, and he's also afraid of the United States, as I said before, as this sort of capitalist juggernaut that's just going to come in and dominate Europe, which ironically is, that's some of what happens in the Cold War. Is that the United States does, exert, a tremendous amount of economic influence over continental Europe. But yeah, so as far as Germany is concerned, they're fine with the British remaining a world empire with overseas possessions. What they really are trying to do, just in and again, this is it's hard because it so much of this is tangled up in the way that Nazism fuses kind of colonial imperial geopolitics on the one hand with this genocidal violence on the other. Um, in the case of Japan, Japan is very much um, under the belief that what they're going to be able to do is really take advantage of the disruptions that are taking place in Europe with the war against France, and then later on the war against the Soviet Union, that they're gonna take advantage of the situation to kick the Western empires out of Asia once and for all, and establish themselves as the preeminent imperial power in the Far East. Uh, and you can and this is ultimately this is why they attack Pearl Harbor, which is the event that brings the United States once and for all into the war as a full-scale belligerent. The plan behind the Japanese plan behind attacking Pearl Harbor is that they will start this war. They will against the United States. They will deal a decisive blow to the U.S. Navy, and that blow will convince the American people that it's not worth fighting a full-blown war against Japan in order to maintain control of the Philippines. Right? The Americans aren't particularly interested in the Philippines to begin with. There is already a plan in place prior to the outbreak of World War II, whereby the United States is preparing the Philippines for independence. So Japanese leaders are gambling and hoping that the United States simply won't be willing to fight a war to defend its colonial possessions in East Asia. And again, this the underlying idea is that Japan is not seeking world domination. They're seeking a sort of regional sphere of influence that if the Americans are thinking clearly, at least this in the eyes of Japanese leaders, the Americans won't be troubled enough by all of this to fight a full-blown war. Now they are completely wrong in that, and it backfires. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor ends up convincing the American people to enter the war and fight the war, and in pursuit of unconditional surrender and complete victory, which is kind of an interesting dynamic in its own right. But yeah, so there is very much a sense among the Axis leaders that what they're doing need not force the other world powers to immediately intervene to stop them.
Then in 1943, it becomes clear that the Allies are winning, increasingly clear. And you show that they more and more, both the Soviet Union and the United States and Britain, the goal starts to be more and more, they're looking ahead. They're not just looking at defeating Nazi Germany and Japan because they already know they're going to win. They are already looking ahead to the future after that and how they can maximize their own imperial gains towards the other. In other words, even starting in 1943, increasingly for the United States and the Soviet Union, the other side is already becoming not an enemy yet, of course, but like a future competitor. And they're
Right.
already putting that into their strategy. So in other words, you could even say, to put it a bit provocative, that the Cold War actually starts in 1943, like very, very slowly, of course. They're still
Mhm.
allies until the end of the war. And they do have hope that they can stay allies until the end of the war, but they want to increase their own spheres of influence. And they
Yeah.
all are becoming increasingly aware also that whoever occupies a certain territory will get to put their system in place. It becomes more clear that, like if you want to like increase your power, you need to conquer more territory. And so what the US and Britain are doing now, they're trying to find the exact right timing to get into Europe with the Normandy landing so that they can decrease, like minimize their own casualties and put most of the fighting on the Red Army. But on the other hand, to get to get in there right on time so they can conquer as much territory and hopefully they even dream of like maybe we can get to Berlin first so
Yeah.
that most of Europe falls into the hand of the Western allies. And that's just the most important way this kind of thinking ahead,
Mhm.
knowing that victory is almost assured, um, shows up in their strategy. Can you explain that a bit more?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good characterization. So I actually identify November of 1942 as this really critical moment. And historians like to do this sometimes, is they
Yeah.
they zoom in so narrowly and on a specific chunk of time. But I think it's interesting to look at what's happening in the world in November of 1942. This is a little bit less than a year after the Pearl Harbor attacks. Um, and there are three really critical military campaigns that are taking place. November is this pivotal month for them. On the one hand, you have the Battle of Stalingrad, right? Which is the by many accounts, it's understood as the largest battle in human history. Again, just going back to the scale of the fighting on the Eastern Front between Germany and the Soviet Union just dwarfs the fighting anywhere else except for China. But so there's the Soviets are turning the tide at Stalingrad in November of 42. The United States is turning the tide in the battle for Guadalcanal, which is this critical, arguably the critical battle of the Pacific War, where the outer limits of the Japanese Empire are essentially drawn, and the United States begins pushing the Japanese back. The Americans are able to. It's incredible that I mean it's essentially a battle of attrition between it uses the Japanese Navy and the American Navy, but it's American Marines on Guadalcanal fighting the Japanese Army on Guadalcanal, and it's a war of attrition. And the United States is sustaining this across these, halfway across the globe, right? The Navy has this pipeline, and is actually able to defeat Japan in this attritional struggle for Guadalcanal in 1942. At the same time, or in rather in November of 42 is the turning point. At the same time, also in November of 42, is Operation Torch, which U.S. Forces are landing in North Africa. Right? And the fact that the United States is able to do both of these things in the same month, right, less than a year after being after the Pearl Harbor attacks, the notion the United States was not prepared for the Second World War, yet it's sustaining these campaigns. But so essentially, I argue that November 42, Stalingrad, Guadalcanal, and Torch it's a pivotal moment in world in well, it's a pivotal moment in the history of the war, but it's also a pivotal moment in world history because this is the moment when you witness the superpowers fully eclipsing the old imperial powers, right? Prior to this, the Japanese in this sort of old-fashioned 19th century type imperialism had been able to conquer large chunks of territory across much of East Asia. The British had been fighting against the Germans in North Africa. It wasn't exactly a stalemate, but there wasn't a enormous amount of movement. The British had gotten the upper hand or they were starting to get the upper hand in Egypt. But it's really with the landing of the Americans in North Africa that the scales in North Africa and the Mediterranean shift decisively against the Axis. So this is really the moment where it's a turning point in the war, but it's also the period where the superpowers emerge as it becomes clear to I think reasonable observers watching international affairs in the fall of 1942 that the post-war world will be dominated by the United States and the Soviet Union. Stalingrad is also the moment when you finally stop hearing these conversations among British and American leaders about, essentially what happens if the Soviets lose, right? What if Germany defeats the Soviet Union? After Stalingrad, there's a marked shift in the tone of the conversations among Western leaders, where they're no longer worried about the Soviets losing the war; they're worried about the Soviets winning the war, right? So what happens when the Soviets defeat Germany, and how are we going to deal with the Soviet Union? And so it's really in the late fall of 1942 and the beginning of 1943 that you start to see this transformation in the discourse among the Western allies, that and they start looking toward, not they're no longer focused on defeating the Axis powers, and now they're focused on planning for the post-war world. And I think that is, on the one hand, there's a recognition that the Soviet Union is not going to collapse, and that the Soviets will, be there at the end of the war, and that the Axis powers will be defeated. But it's also a recognition that these older imperial powers, the British, obviously the French, but even the sort of, the sort of more old-fashioned empire like the one that Japan is trying to build, that these forces have really been eclipsed by the superpowers, and the post-war world is going to be controlled by these continent-spanning superstates with global force projection capabilities. And there's not going to be a return to the pre-World War II status quo. The post-45 world will look dramatically different, and that it is crucial for the United States uh, and the Soviet Union to figure that out. And Stalin and Soviet leaders want it to be a post-war world that sort of looks to the Soviet Union for leadership, and Roosevelt and the Americans want the post-war world to look to the United States.
I think there are a lot of thinkers, were a lot of thinkers back then and also today in the global South who would be far less surprised by your book. They would say like, yeah, that's how we see things,
Yeah.
because a lot of anti-colonial thinkers, I think Frantz Fanon was one of them, and Nehru in India,
Mhm.
they have pointed out, they said like, well, the Nazis are like the evil twin sort of the British and the French empires, and there are quotes like that where they compare them. The Indian leadership, for example, was wise enough to see that they were even worse. That's why some of them actually had, with some conviction, joined the British against the Nazis. And people should really realize what that actually means, because they suffered horribly from British imperialism. And then to see that the other side is even worse and have like a contemporary alliance sort of is something that we should really be grateful for the Indian leadership. Um, but their perspective is also not honored enough, I think. I think they saw this as a chance to liberate themselves,
Yeah.
um, because they saw that imperialism is weakened by this whole war, and they also see that it is discredited, you know,
Yeah.
and that is the way it is discredited shows in the, let's say, the official war aims of the United States, where you do
Mhm.
see a difference, at least in the rhetoric. And I think there's at least some difference in some way that is a bit hard to um, to explain exactly in like what the difference is. But the U.S. empire and also the Soviet empire is not the same as the British and the French empire. And they claim during the war that they are fighting for the freedom and national sovereignty of all nations, and they're fighting against imperialism. And you show in the book that Churchill was very clear about saying like, yeah, sure, but only for the white races, not for, it
Hmm.
doesn't include our empire. He was basically saying we're fighting for the freedom of everyone except for all the people that we colonize.
Right.
And the US didn't really challenge that. They also didn't challenge their Soviet allies and their crimes and their imperialism over Eastern Europe. One could
Hmm.
argue they were not in a position to do that. But still, I mean, they didn't really even try, even when it became clear the United States is going to be the most powerful nation on the planet. Um, I'm not sure what my question now is to you. Yeah, but can you t tell a bit more about the perspective of the global South and what it meant for them, for the former colonies, and how did they view this, and how were they able to isn't it fair to say they were able to take advantage of that? And isn't it also fair to say that even so there was so much hypocrisy in the
Hmm.
American declarations of the war aims, it was
Yeah.
not only hypocrisy. Was there
Mm.
already during the war already the roots of a system that at least in some ways is a little more humane and has a bit more respect for the national sovereignty of other nations?
Yeah. I think that's true. I think that yeah, and I would go back to, the larger point I've been making that this is why it's helpful to think about World War II not as kind of a story unto itself, but rather as this really important chapter in a longer sweep of world history,
Mm,
longer, story about the rise and fall of empires.
mhm,
Because I think there is a general recognition among leaders around the world, leaders and populations around the world, that World War II marks a turning point in the international order, in the world order that exists. And that the world after the end of the war is going to fundamentally look different than the war that existed in the 1930s, leading in, or than the world that existed in the 1930s. And so I think it's helpful to think about all of these different figures, whether they're in the United States or Britain or Germany or the Soviet Union or Sub-Saharan Africa or Japan, Indonesia, French Indochina. They are looking at a world that is changing beneath their feet, and they're trying to make the best moves that they can to prepare themselves for this new world order that will emerge. Now, from the perspective of a lot of people in the colonized world, they face a very very real choice, right? Do they say you're a subject of the say you're an anti-colonial nationalist, in a colony of the British Empire. The British Empire is in trouble, circa 1940, 1941, 1942. And this is a moment where you're going to have to choose sides. And there is an argument that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right?
mhm,
And the notion that the best thing you can do if say you're a leader in India is to throw your lot in with the Axis powers, because the Axis powers are fighting against the British Empire, and anything that hurts the British Empire will ultimately benefit you and your nationalist aspirations. The counter argument is that the Axis powers are just imperial powers in their own right, and in many ways, or probably in most ways, they're even worse than the other Western empires. And so it is just absolutely abhorrent to support the aims of any of the Axis powers. And then there's also the concern that whichever side that you pick, you might be picking the wrong side.
mhm,
And so in the case of a lot of these nationalist leaders around the colonial world, that chose to support the Axis powers, I think generally they were doing it not because they agreed with the larger visions or aims of the Axis powers, but rather they saw this as kind of an expedient measure to weaken the existing imperial powers that had controlled things for so long for them. Right, so you see this early on with the French. You also see this with the British. But for every one of these anti-colonial nationalists that ends up throwing in their lot with the Axis powers, you also have these other figures that see this as an opportunity. They're still nationalists, but they see this as an opportunity to support the existing imperial powers, say the British or the French, for the time being, uh, but to arrange assurances and promises that after the war is over, after the Axis powers are defeated, that that independence, or at least greater autonomy and self-determination, will be forthcoming from the established imperial powers. Now, to add another layer of complexity to all of this, you again have these rising superpowers in the United States and the Soviet Union that have their own vision, right? And they're also, I think, genuinely they're opposed to colonialism. They understand that colonialism is problematic for all sorts of reasons. It's morally problematic, but increasingly, by the time that we get into the 20th century, it's politically problematic. It's militarily problematic. It's economically problematic. The sort of dividends that that overseas colonies may have paid in the 18th century no longer look the same by the time we get to the middle decades of the 20th century. The sort of the ideas and the socio-political force that is nationalism has swept around the world, and so these populations are much harder. A population of South Asia that identifies as an Indian nation is much harder to govern and control by a small number of British colonial officials than a society that doesn't have that same sense of nationalism. So I think there's an awareness of that that is definitely widespread. And the Americans and the Soviets have come up with new models for a sort of quasi-imperialism. I think as time goes by and we get deeper into the 21st century, it becomes more clear that this sort of this neo-imperialism that would appear after the end of World War II actually has a lot more in common with the older types of imperialism
Mhm.
than people would have thought in the 1950s and 1960s. But I think it is absolutely true. The United States um, doesn't want a world of empires to reappear after 1945. The American leaders want a new world in which colonial empires will gradually be phased out. They see this as a gradual transition. The process of decolonization that actually takes place after 1945 happens much more abruptly than American leaders would want. Um, but that's for a lot of different reasons, many of them tracing back to the Second World War. Um, but the Americans want a sort of liberal capitalist empire of consumption, right? They don't want to go out and conquer new colonial territories and add Greenland to an American empire. And the historian Daniel Imvor actually makes the point, which I think is a very good one, that the United States is one of the only, really powerful nations to win a major war and not annex any new territory, right? The Americans, if they had wanted to, they were potentially in a position to annex all sorts of new territories after the end of World War II, and that doesn't really happen, right? They keep bases, right? They build this sort of, what people have called a pointillist empire, of bases around the world, but they're not going in and trying to conquer new territories. And in fact, they maintain their commitment to end the American colonial control of the Philippines. Right, the United States wins World War II, and then in the years after World War II, essentially liquidates its, or gets rid of its largest colony, and gives its largest colony at least formal independence. And indeed, this is something that, it goes, there is a very deep strain in American history, this sort of anti-colonialism, and this, I think, very sincere belief that that empires are bad for business. And what the United States wants to do is it wants to create a capitalist empire. And it is a capitalist empire that will not directly interfere with the self-determination of foreign states, at least insofar as the sort of political systems that they operate, and the day-to-day activities of their populations. What the United States wants to do is it wants to have free and unfettered access to their economies. Right? The United States wants an empire of free trade, and in that regard, imperial systems are a problem for American leaders. Right? And this stretches um, back to the 18th century, and the very beginning of the United States as an independent nation. The Americans don't particularly like foreign empires, because foreign empires create closed systems, right? They operate against free trade, and the United States, heading into the 20th century, is the largest industrial power in the world. It has it can produce goods more cheaply than other nations. And this is something that's just accelerated by the First and Second World Wars, particularly after World War II. The United States is just in this position of unimaginable economic and industrial power. All of the other major industrial economies of the world had been just absolutely devastated by the fighting of World War II, and instead, in contrast, the American economy has grown, by by leaps and bounds during the war, and the United States is really sort of an unrivaled economic and industrial power circa 1945. And so the last thing the Americans want to see is the world carved up into separate political units under the control of foreign empires that are going to be closed to the sale of American consumer goods. Um,
Yeah,
if
I
Yeah, so I'm rambling.
I think there's also, but your book also gives us an idea about why the US, develops at the end of the Second World War a new form of imperialism and why it's so successful. Um, because as you point out, like the United States at the end of the war is by far the biggest winner. In fact, it's the only winner because the British Empire is severely weakened, the French Empire is very weakened, the
Mhm.
Dutch Empire, and the Soviets they won, but they are destroyed and they lost like 27 million people or something like that. They
Yeah.
then they are destroyed, and of course Germany and Japan are destroyed, the cities are destroyed. So pretty much everybody lost. Much of the global south is devastated and lost. Not to forget about them. So the
Mhm.
only real winner is actually the United States, and now it is the number one global superpower. And so how did it get, what does World War II tell us about how they got there? Because I think the strategy that you talk about, and I think is very important, was the way to get there, to not become a land empire that like occupies countries everywhere and then has to like rule over them, but just have a sort of like light touch everywhere, but on the other hand, that enables you to be everywhere. So they have like the ability for amphibious landings and of a global air force, a global navy, and it's sort of like a strategy of we can be everywhere, and if we want, we can be brutal. See Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Like, don't fuck with us. Don't think we're just like the new some sort of like peace power only. Like we can be brutal if we want to. But we're ready to make arrangements with everyone. Now, these arrangements, of course, often are very unfair, like in favor of the United States.
Right.
But they are certainly often at least a little bit, depends on the country and the history, but sometimes at least a little better deal than be fully occupied because that just leads to more resistance. And I think World War II is also one of the critical time periods where the global South just becomes stronger, where it's harder to colonize you. I mean, just at the end of Second World War and after, we have big colonial struggles, often with a lot of success, for example, in Indonesia, and then
Right.
in India, of course, most importantly,
Yeah.
and also in China to some degree with yeah, with the victory of Mao Zedong, and then he says, like we stepped into the light of history, and so no, that was narrow actually. Um, excuse me.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, so the colonial the global South forces are getting stronger also because of weapons technology. The and this classical strategy of outright taking off your land or enslaving people becomes more dangerous, more costly, and less lucrative. And the
Right.
United States learns basically if we have a new kind of imperialism, then we can be a global power. We get our will with a little less obvious cruelty and a little more um, canner. Or
Yeah.
is that a fair description of?
I think so. Yeah, I think it's a fair description. A couple things. One of the other changes that takes place in the global South is that these political leaders, but also just the general populations, a lot of them were involved in resistance against the Axis occupations, particularly in East Asia, right? So there are what you get with the experience of the Japanese occupations of a lot of these colonial territories around the Pacific is that you get kind of mobilized Vietnamese or Indonesian or Korean military leaders, right? Who have the experience of actually fighting. On the one hand, they get fighting experience. On the other, they're watching, at least in the early years of the war, they're watching Japanese forces just humiliating these Western military
Mhm.
troops, right? And so a lot of the mystique surrounding the Western empires has fallen apart, and Japan has shown that Western military forces are not invincible, right? They
Mhm.
can be defeated, and there is so I think the experience of Japanese imperialism in Asia has a complicated impact on the sort of anti-colonial nationalism, right? Because on the one hand, Japan shows that non-Western forces can fight and win, but also its resistance to the Japanese imperialism and Japanese colonialism that mobilizes these populations. Um, I mean, I'd push back a little bit against this view that the Soviets don't win the war. Yes, they're on the winning side, but I think that particularly if, once you leave the United States and the UK,
Mhm.
uh, and some of once you break away from the sort of the historical narratives that have been dominated by American and British historians in the Anglophone world, um, you see that the Soviet Union um, wins a huge moral victory in the Second World War, at least in the eyes of millions and millions of people around the world. And a lot of people in the global South actually look at what the Soviets did, and they're more inspired by the Soviet, but the Soviet contributions to the war. And the sort of Soviet role in defeating Nazi Germany than they are by the Americans and the British. And so, just in terms of diplomatic and political influence, the Soviet Union wins a great deal in the Second World War. And after 1945, I think we often forget just how much of a pariah the Bolshevik state was in the interwar years in the 1920s and 1930s. Post 45, the Soviet Union would be a very, very important player on the world stage. And not just because of its size and not just because of its military prowess, but also because of this tremendous victory that the Soviets secured in the war. And then, of course, the Soviet Union has a massive military that and we can talk about this more later if you want. But the Americans and the British believe that if the Soviets want to, they can just roll across Western Europe, and there's really very little that the Americans and the British can do to stop the Red Army if Stalin decides to unleash it on the West. So I think the Soviets, are victors in the war. But
Mhm.
I also, the United States is the biggest victor in the war. And I think there is a lot to the argument that this sort of the age of golden abundance in the United States that characterizes the 1950s, 1960s, into the 1970s, that a lot of this is actually driven by the reality that the rest of the world's industrialized economies have been destroyed. The United States, has built up its industrial base. It was, it's bankrolling a lot of the war. It's producing all sorts of war materials. Those factories and those workers that are in the factories still exist after 1945, after Japan is defeated. And they're not producing planes and tanks and aircraft carriers anymore, at least not as many. They're producing consumer goods, and the United States needs somebody to sell that to. And the Americans, as I already discussed, the Americans are not particularly keen on going out and conquering new colonial territories for all sorts of reasons. Um, and they want prosperous, independent nation states around the world that are going to be able to engage in trade with the United
Mhm.
States, so that all this consumer junk that is being created in American factories actually has markets. Um, Beyond that, the Second World War has also caused the United States to build by far the most powerful nation or the most powerful navy in the world. We've the story of the transformation of the American Navy in World War II is really kind of astonishing. They're just cranking out aircraft carriers. They are, at the end of the war, they just dominate pretty much every ocean in the world, and they are capable of just astonishing global force projection. The Americans they can stage amphibious operations all over the world, right? And going back to what I talked about earlier, the fact that in November of 1942, they're fighting, these a large battle in the South Pacific in Guadalcanal, and also landing troops in North Africa. In June of 1944, the Americans spearhead the invasion of France. Right, they staged D-Day, the Overlord operation. That pretty much at the same time, they're invading Saipan in the Pacific as well. So
Mhm.
the United States has the capacity to launch multiple large-scale amphibious campaigns on opposite sides of the globe, by 1944. Um, they've got these, as I said, the aircraft carrier task force groups are just this, unimaginable. It's an accretion of power that is unimaginable if you go back to the late 1930s. That it's inconceivable that a country could do this. Meanwhile, we haven't even gotten to the atomic bomb, right? The Americans
Mhm.
have an air force that can reach cities almost anywhere in the world. Fairly soon. By the time that we get into the Cold War, pretty much any city in the world is open to attack from U.S. Military aircraft carrying atomic bombs, right? So the
Right.
United States can essentially just wipe out a city anywhere in the world whenever it wants. or at least, in theory it could. And all of this power, going back to the, just the industrial power and the scale of the industrial economy, it's all created in World War II. The United States has a world-spanning system of bases that it acquires in the course of fighting the Second World War that allow it to launch either amphibious invasions or atomic airstrikes all over the world. And this is added to the sort of industrial dominance that is born of the war's devastation. And that's the system that, and the Americans decide that they're going to exercise power that way, that they don't, because they are so powerful and because they have so many
Mm,
subtle ways to
mm.
exercise influence, that they don't need to go into foreign territories and wage colonial conquests, because that style of being a world power is now obsolete because of World War II.
Yeah, you discussed documents both by the British and also by the US, where they are basically considering going to war with the Soviet Union directly, like having the next World War, basically. Of course, they don't do it. But can you explain that a bit? Why is that relevant, and what does it show us? And um,
So, this is there's a pretty famous document called Operation Unthinkable, and it's drawn up really in at the closing, just after German surrender in Europe. The war is ongoing against Japan. Japan has not been defeated yet. But this is in I believe it's the spring of 1945. Germany has surrendered. And Churchill asks his military planners to draw up a war plan for an attack on the Soviet Union to begin in a matter of weeks, right? So this isn't a long-term plan to, what happens if Stalin decides to launch a war in 1950. No, this is a war that would begin in a matter of weeks. It would use the existing deployments of American, Canadian, and British and Polish forces in Western Europe to launch an attack against the Soviet Union for the purpose of pushing the Soviets back out of Eastern Europe and liberating states like Poland, and kind of reunifying Germany under Western control. And so essentially what happens is British planners go through, they look at the various numbers of Soviet troops, and they determine that the Soviets have a 2-to-1 advantage in troops, and that as a result of this, if the Western forces did launch an attack on the Soviet Union, they would essentially be steamrolled and push off the continent. Um, and that the only the only recourse that would potentially stave off a just catastrophic defeat would be to re-enlist the German military, the Nazi forces that have just been defeated in the Second World War, to rearm them, reorganize them, and send them into the renewed battle against the Soviet Union. And because the prospect of victory would be so slim, they call the plan Operation Unthinkable.
Mhm.
Now, I think this is fascinating for a number of reasons. Um, One can say that, of course, war planners make plans, right? It's their job to, they would be delinquent in their duties if they didn't have a plan for a clash with the Soviet Union. But what's clear from Operation Unthinkable is that, the British and the Americans already view the Soviet Union as an adversary. Um, and they're not so if we were to kind of embrace the conventional explanation of World War II as a war against fascism, right? This should have been a moment of great victory and optimism, right? The fascists have been defeated. A new world can be created. It will be a world that will be peaceful, and aggressive warfare will be made illegal, and it will be obsolete, and it will it will fade into the distant history. But instead of sort of celebrating this victory, these Western leaders are planning for another war, right? And I think what that does is it suggests to us that there's something else going on here. It's not the goal of the goal of this war was not just to defeat fascism. Rather, this was part of a larger struggle for power around the world, right? And now that the Axis threat has been eliminated, or is in the process of being eliminated, Japan is still not defeated. Um, Now the next challenge is coming from the Soviet Union, right? So I think what it does is it sort of directs our attention, um, away from this narrative that is based around an anti-fascist war, and focuses it much more on a narrative based on an ongoing struggle for power between various imperial states, with expansive definitions of what constitutes national security. And that I think that's the world that the Second World War created. And that's what was left to us, I think.
And it seems also that helps explain why they were not able to keep the alliance after and avoid the Cold War,
Mhm.
after the war. I don't know, do you think the book also, like, the ending of the book also explains a little bit of the origins of the Cold War? There's some contribution with that, or is that more your other book?
I think it does. Yeah, I mean, it does contribute to the you know to debates about the origins of the Cold War. I actually place it. I would say that the Cold War probably starts in 1942. I think it's the failure to open a second front
Wow.
in Europe. Um, there had been promises made to Stalin, that were were not kept, and it was probably impossible to keep those promises. But I think that I think you can see the origins of the Cold War. I think fairly clearly, even going back to 1942.
Mhm.
Um, and ultimately that goes back to the larger argument that the Second World War is really just a key chapter in a much larger story about the rise and fall of empires. And so while victory in 1945 against the Axis powers settles one part, or one narrative thread in that story, there is still plenty of other narrative threads that are in existence. Um, and so, the fact that the Soviets and the Americans, the British, are planning for a war against each other, before Japan is even defeated, I think is an indication that what's really going on here is a clash of powerful world empires, rather than a crusade to rid the world of the scourge of fascism. Because of course, if all you want to do is get rid of fascism, why are you going to rearm the German military to fight against the Soviet Union?
Yeah, that's one of the greatest ironies in world history, that the US then built up Germany and Japan, like, pretty just a few years after the war. And of course, I mean, I grew up in West Germany, so I'm glad they did, because it turned out well in a way. But I mean, they never, I do think if they would have put themselves more into the shoes of the Soviet leadership at that time and what that looks like for them,
Right.
they maybe it would have been possible to avoid the Cold War. Maybe, I'm saying.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and
But who
part of the
knows?
one of the great ironies of the war, I think, and I always kind of end my when I teach classes on this, I always leave this as kind of a parting thought with the students, is that German and Japanese leaders, in the lead up to World War II, were really hoping, to become the preeminent powers in Europe and East Asia.
Hmm.
And then World War II happened, and the United States defeated, or rather, the Allies defeated Germany and Japan, and then proceeded throughout the Cold War to turn them into the preeminent powers in Europe and East Asia.
Yeah.
at least for a time in Japan's case.
Wow. I think we made it. We gave the audience an impression of um, why they should stay curious and open-minded about the second world. Also, thank you for correcting me sometimes, bringing more nuance to like my sometimes also a bit simplistic viewpoints. But
Not
um,
at all. This is a much deeper exploration of the book than I've had with anybody else. I'm very impressed with your engagement.
thanks. Yeah, I read it quite thoroughly because I was fascinated. And in Germany, it's still like oftentimes the number one topic, everything around it. And a lot of things I'm saying here would be most controversial in Germany. In fact,
Yeah,
sometimes people were asking me if I was a right-wing nationalist just because I was talking about the crimes of the Allies. And I always pointed, not at
yeah,
all. I'm a left-winger and I'm glad that the Allies won, It's just,
right.
these things are unfortunately are very more controversial in Germany. I mean, for good reason in a way.
Yeah,
Um,
it's so
thank you.
controversial in the United States as well. It's very
Hmm.
controversial, and going back to one of the original points that you brought up, that it's this sort of moral clarity of the war that makes
Yeah,
it so hard to to come up with new interpretations and to think differently and challenge our preconceptions about what the world was, because as soon as you start asking questions like this, it seems like you're suggesting that, well, maybe it was unfortunate that the war turned out the way it did,
yeah,
which is absolutely not the case. It was horrific. It would have been horrific for the Axis powers to win.
yeah. I mean, I don't think there were many people back then who like supported the Allied forces, but were not blind to what they were doing. And I guess it would have been almost superhuman to be like that, but
Yeah.
it would have been the right thing. So.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I really hope we can do something similar to your other book that I also highly recommend, the Cold War Killing Fields, about the Cold War, sometime in the
Great.
future.
Yeah, I'll look forward to it.
Right. So, yeah, I highly recommend the book. It is, I think it's one of the most important books on the Second World War and just challenges the common narrative, and it needs to be challenged. Thank you so much, Paul.
Thank you for having me. I enjoyed it.
Enjoyed it too. Bye.